Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good morning. We are taping on Wednesday, May 21st here in the Rabbi Chill Sanctuary with our full clergy team. Yay. Welcome back, Elias. And Michelle, it's been so great to have you the last few weeks. And Elisa and Dan, always great. So I am so excited for this class, and I'll tell you why. There's a great Garrison Kaler story. Garrison Kaler is this humorist and this satirist and this writer. And he tells the story that in 1974, he was with his family, his wife and children, on a train from Minneapolis to San Francisco. And he had just been given a $6,000 gig by the New Yorker to write 2 stories. And he's writing his stories. This is 1974, so a different universe ago. Pen and paper on a tablet. And he writes and he writes and he writes, and he's just in flow. And he's just having a gusher. And he writes not 1 story, but 2 stories. And he thinks these are the funniest stories and the best stories and the wisest stories that he's ever written. He's just writing. And then the train hits kind of like a derailment situation, and they're going to have to get off the train. He's in Idaho. He's going to have to get off the train and get onto another train. And so he goes to the restroom, and he doesn't want to lose these incredible stories. So he puts them in his briefcase, and he goes to the restroom, and he does his business. And then there's a lot of energy and chaotic energy because they have to get off the train, and he forgets his briefcase. And his 2 stories are in the briefcase, and they are lost stories, and he can never find them. And he goes on to say he could never write those stories again. The best stories that he ever wrote, the funniest stories that he ever wrote, were in that briefcase, and they're lost. He couldn't recover them. Now, I mention that because for years, I remember studying this text from the Talmud, a sugya, and it felt like the best text I had ever read, like the wisest text that I had ever read. And I remember it dealt with a really hard issue, and the hard issue was that the Torah gives us a stricture, a restriction that is noxious, just abominable to modern sensibilities, that just is just this dog don't hunt for a modern person. But instead of rejecting it categorically, it offers a couple of different moves to say, yeah, of course the stricture is here, but then it undermines it. And I remember this text, and for years I could never find this text. And then our member, Robbie Fine, told me about this text. He says, oh, yeah, it's from Megillah 24. And in fact, I wrote a Devar Torah about it 14 years ago at the Newton Center Minyan, and he sent me the Devar, and it included the site to the text, and I have it and I read it, and it's even better than I thought. So, without further ado, let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then we'll take a look at the recovered, missing, brilliant Talmudic text.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu v'fi amcha beit Yisrael, v'nihya anachnu v'tzatza'enu v'tzatza'ei amcha beit Yisrael, kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah li'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah.
So where did he get paid?
I don't know if he got paid, but he has a story about the lost stories that he never recovered. But the good news is we have recovered the Talmudic text. So the stricture that it offers was actually from last week's portion. It's Emor, and it's the passage that actually our wonderful Bar Mitzvah last week, Morris Fleiss, talked about in his Devar. It's the stricture from Emor, which says that unless a priest is perfect, the priest can't offer God's food, can't officiate. And so I thought, Elisa, if you'll read this is pages 1 and 2 from Emor. The Lord spoke further to Moses.
The Lord spoke further to Moses, speak to Aaron and say, no man of your offspring throughout the ages who has a defect shall be qualified to offer the food of his God. No one at all who has a defect shall be qualified. No man who is blind or lame or has a limb too short or too long. No man who has a broken leg or a broken arm, or who is a hunchback or a dwarf, or who has a growth in his eye, or who has a boil scar or scurvy or crushed testes. No man among the offspring of Aaron the priest who has a defect shall be qualified to offer the Lord's gift. Having a defect, he shall not be qualified to offer the food of his God. He may eat of the food of his God, of the most holy as well as of the holy, but he shall not enter behind the curtain or come near the altar, for he has a defect. He shall not profane these places sacred to me, for I, the Lord, have sanctified them.
Right. Now, so we read this as moderns in 2025, that you have to be perfect. But one thing that I wanted, and obviously it's indefensible from a modern point of view, but one thing that I wanted to bring up, because when I finally found the Garrison Kaler Talmud that Rabbi Fein helped me recover, I noticed something about the text which mirrors this Torah passage that it's going to be in dialogue with. And what I wanted to surface is and name is a pretty short passage. It's the content is from verses 17 to verse 23, so not many verses at all. And it mentions not once and not twice and not 3 times, but 4 times that if you've got a defect, you're out. No man of your offspring throughout their ages who has a defect shall be qualified to offer the food of his God. We got it. Defect, you're out. No one at all who has a defect shall be qualified. Okay, God, you said it 2 times. And then a few verses later, no man among the offspring of Aaron the priest who has a defect shall be qualified to offer the Lord's gift. That's 3. Having a defect, he shall not be qualified to offer the food of his God. That's 4. So you have 2 doublets, and keep that in mind when we get to the Torah, or when we get to the Talmudic passage. Why the repetition? If you live in a world where every letter counts, every word counts, there's not a wasted syllable, there's nothing superfluous, everything has a reason. The Torah is perfect. That's our hermeneutic principle. Why the fourfold repetition? Any takers? And in general, what comes up for you when you encounter this hard text?
It makes it a huge emphasis on the halakha. Saying it that many times means that you're not going to forget it.
Yeah.
That would be the reason, I guess.
So in halachic terminology, it's d'oraita, it's biblical. It's very explicitly in the Torah. It's very explicitly in the voice of God, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, and it's a fourfold repetition, right? And now what do you do when something that is so clear and so repeated and from such a high authority, the highest, is so not defensible and not acceptable to actual people? And that's what the Talmudic text is going to deal with.
What's interesting to me is that this is totally the opposite Torah that God gives to Moses, right? Moses comes to God and says, I have a defect. I'm not perfect. I don't have all the skills that you want. And God says, are you crazy? This is exactly why I want you. And so it's also this word mum, which is translated as defect. Like, it's so interesting to, yes, it's not good Torah to say that somebody with a disability cannot participate fully. And I have the question of, like, what does this mean? What is this that disqualifies someone? And it's not disqualifies them from everything. It's from this particular service. And, there's realities that all of us are disqualified from particular service. I will never be a great basketball player. It's just not in my cards for me. And not because God doesn't love me and not because the world isn't great, but because I'm also not gonna be a great volleyball player. And I think that's okay. So I think we have to be able to tune into this in a particular way and hear the potential wisdom that exists in this before just judging it and throwing it out.
Okay, Elias?
Yeah, what stands out to me by reading this text is that it doesn't say anything about the character of the person. It doesn't say, you shouldn't be a cheater, you shouldn't be a bully, you shouldn't be a killer. It focuses only on the physicality of the person, right, which is completely, in this day and age when anywhere you hire somebody, even as clergy people, the first thing and most important thing, in addition of the skills, is your personality. How good you are, how good of a team player you are, how decent you are, and there's nothing
about character. It's all on the surface. And just, Eliza, I applaud your apologetic instinct to try to pretzel yourself into defending the Torah, which I wouldn't do here, because it is true that you and I cannot be NBA players, right? It is true that none of us can be brain surgeons. It is true that I'm not going to be singing Hineni anytime soon. It is true that we all have skill sets and we all don't have skills that we need to do certain jobs. That is all true, but I think that's apologetic. Let me just finish the point. What this text is saying is that those physical defects make you not holy. Make you, this is God says that if you come in with a limb too short, or you're blind, or you're lame, or any of these things, that profanes. I mean, that is lo yigash kimumbo velo yechalel et mikdashai. That your physical defect profanes my holy space. That's hard to defend. Michelle?
So once, many years ago, when I was a rabbinical student and we were in Israel, they took us to see a sort of a postmodern Israeli play, all in Hebrew. And there were these people running around the stage. It was dark, and they were just shouting, "Mumbo, Mumbo, Mumbo," like trying to bring out the ridiculousness of saying that your physicality would be what would define that you have a defect, right? That only focusing on this one thing, and it's part of what later becomes the culture that we actually take our families and our teenagers to see every time we go to Israel, Nalagaat, which is a place where you can actually experience what it is like to have one of these disabilities, and to see that very much it is the opposite of mumbo, that the rest of us are failing in our perception in some way that they do not have access to. So I actually love what the Talmud is going to do with this, because that repetition of mumbo, of that there's some defect in you, is calling out to us to say, well, wait a minute, how do I understand this defect? And it seems like the defect, when seen through the eyes of the Talmud here, may be less about the priests themselves and more about how the kahal, the community, experiences that.
Great. So let's get to it. We're on page 3. Michelle, would you pick up with the Mishnah, bottom of page 3, a Kohen whose hands are blemished?
Glasses on. A Kohen whose hands are blemished may not raise his hands to bless the people. Rabbi Yehuda says, even a Kohen whose hands are stained with woad may not raise his hands to bless the people, because the people will stare at him while he recites the blessing.
So if you're a Kohen and your hands have a blemish, or let's say you're a tanner or a dyer, or you work with colors and your hands are stained, then when you raise your hands, people will be focused on that and they won't be able to receive the blessing. And then read one more paragraph, if you will.
Absolutely. Do you want me to start from the bottom?
No, it was taught in a Braita.
It was taught in a Braita. The blemishes that they said disqualify a Kohen from blessing the people are those found on his face, his hands, and his feet. The Gemara now cites various blemishes of the hand that disqualify the Kohen from blessing the people. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says a Kohen whose hands are spotted may not raise his hands to bless the people. It was also thusly taught in a Braita, a Kohen whose hands are spotted may not raise his hands to bless the people. If his hands are bent forward or bent to the side, he may not raise his hands to bless the people.
So this sugya is going to be so interesting, and we're going to actually be looking at the sugya, the structure of the sugya. So first of all, it starts by offering lip service and fidelity to the Torah's notion that you have to be kind of physically perfect. This is not about character. This is not about personality. This is about, are your hands blotched, or are your hands crooked? It's about physical perfection. And it starts by going to that. But just not to do a spoiler alert, but the Talmud at the very end of the sugya is going to undermine the beginning. But then and then it has a piece, it's a digression about if you have a different accent, so that your Hebrew sounds different from somebody else's Hebrew. Okay, but now it is going to pick up, and it's going to, after offering some initial lip service to the Emor from last week, it's going to undermine it, and I think it offers some bases for undermining it that are so evocative. This is the Garrison Taylor part that is so powerful. Keep on going, Michelle. The second column on that page, the Gemara cites
yet another disqualification. Rav Huna said, Kohen whose eyes flow with water may not raise his hands to bless the people.
Let's pause. in the footnotes, it's not. One read is that the Kohen's eyes are weepy. The other is, and which makes more sense. And there's a condition. What happens if you drool?
Yeah.
Right. There's a condition of people who drool. You just have saliva coming out, right? Which is a distraction. So, what happens if you have a drooling Kohen? Then it would seem to be that a drooling Kohen really can't officiate, because all you'll be able to think about is the drool. You won't be able to think about the offering. Okay. Now keep going.
But there was a certain Kohen in Rav Huna's neighborhood, and he spread his hands to bless the people, even though his eyes teared excessively, and Rav Huna did not object. The Gemara answers that Kohen was a familiar figure in his city. Hence, since congregants were accustomed to his presence, they would not stare at him during the blessing. He was thus permitted to bless the people.
Right. So Rav Huna offers the ruling that if you're a drooling Kohen, you cannot officiate. But they say, hey, wait a minute, there was a drooling Kohen in your own shul, and you never objected. And his answer was, right, I didn't object because he's ours. He's mine. He's familiar, right? And then there's a bright, just to finish this piece, in the same way that the prohibition is repeated twice in the Torah, in this structure of the Gemara, it's going to add the same thing in a different way. Just keep going one more paragraph.
It was also taught thusly in a Braita, a Kohen whose eyes flow with tears may not raise his hands to bless the people. However, if he is a familiar figure in his city so that people are accustomed to seeing him, it is permitted for him to bless the people.
So colleagues, now our conversation can begin, right? What do you make out of this? That we have a standard, and I'll even affirm the standard, but real people who don't live up to that standard, if they're ours, if we're familiar with them, then we basically relax the standard. What meaning do you make of this?
I think it's more than just that they're ours, right? Like there is, of course, the idea, hey, that's part of our family, and therefore we have a certain normal in our family that's different from somebody else. But I think it's more than that. It's a brilliant recipe for inclusion in our time, because what it is saying is that when the community makes an effort to get to know the person who has some sort of physical challenge, they actually start to not see it in the same way. They become accustomed to it. It becomes a piece of obviously that's totally exactly how Joe is. Like that's Joe. He's like Eliza, right? We all can see each other as the Tselem Elohim that we are, but we have to, as a community, become accustomed to that and accept it as part of our community.
So and the question is, what is it about this drooling Kohen that allows Rav Huna and his shul to be good with this drooling Kohen? The Hebrew is dash be'iro. Dash, and I have a whole page of AI, which is page 6 of your handout. But dash is a threshing, winnowing metaphor from the Bible, like grain, kind of the Book of Ruth threshing. I'm not sure what that means. Ladush in modern Hebrew, also according to AI, means to do something over and over again, like to power through it.
We're invested.
Right. It's just something that you see all the time. So to me, my read of Ladush, of dash be'iro, but I'd love to invite yours, is they're ours. And I want to ask you I want your comments, but also thinking about modern applications. I'll just give you my first application, and that I've heard from so many people, so many, people my age or older, grandparents older than me, will say they're trans advocates. And their story will be, I never thought much about trans, wasn't my issue, and then my grandchild is trans, now trans is my issue. And I hear that story over and over again, like trans was, it was just never my thing, never thought about it. Now it's my grandchild, now it's my thing. And I kind of feel like this is the same thing with LGBTQ, right? And just in general, which was the reason that the prohibitions against gay marriage collapsed in our movement, is everybody knows somebody who's gay. Everybody has somebody who's gay in their family, and therefore it's dash be'iro. It's like the drooling Kohen. They're ours. How can you have a stricture when you see a person before you?
But the stricture is about distraction in davening spaces. The stricture is about any physical reality that will take your attention away from the ritual in a meaningful way. And I wouldn't even go to such an extreme example. I was thinking back to when I first came. I grew up in a congregation that had the practice of singing page numbers. And when I first came here, there were a certain number of community members who were very concerned with singing page numbers.
Or who would laugh.
For whom it was they were like, what are you doing? And I was like, what are you doing? Like, this is what this is my tradition. It's what I grew up with. It's a way to not be distracted in prayer. And they would say, are you kidding? It's way more distracting for you to sing that page number than it is for you to read it. But years in, I don't think, every once in a while we have a bar mitzvah or something and somebody hasn't heard it before and they laugh. But for the most part, it has become more of a normal, right? You've teased me now when I don't sing a page number or when I sing it in the wrong nusach. So I think that familiarity, and I think that this is where I wanted to listen in for the wisdom, not to just throw this text under the bus because it has mum and because it says mum over and over again and because we don't like to think about that, but to think about what's the world they're trying to cultivate and what's the relationship to spiritual community. And I do think it's real. Like, it's real. When we had Yom HaShoah and the speaker was using a phone and kept losing her place, that was distracting. Like, it was objectively distracting and took away from her talk, and not because I think anything badly of her or anything else, but because there was a physical reality that impeded my ability to absorb information. And I think that's a fair thing to, as a community, to say, we want to create an environment in spiritual tradition where people can be focused. And when we build that community practice, and I love, Michelle, your read, that when we do the work to really see everybody and love everyone and affirm everyone, then it's not distracting because we love them and they're ours.
I think also, if we go back to the Torah, to the original part of the Torah, in ancient worship, perception was everything. So when we come to the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Breita, the world has changed already dramatically, so that perception, I think, becomes less and less important, and getting to know who the real person is becomes more important. Right. So I think that's part of it. I think a pope was just elected. Now you have this whole, the world sees a perfect process, but then that movie Conclave, shows that it's really not a perfect process. It goes and delves deeply into the politics. So,
yeah, I just want to name one other really, to me, deep and very moving thing about this, which is, I keep coming to this question of, we have a standard, which is we don't want I'll use your charitable frame. We don't want distractions to our worship space. We don't want distractions to our spirituality. Okay, and these physical things are a distraction. Okay, it's not my cup of tea, but I'll go with it for a minute, right? And now we have the drooling Kohen, but he's Dash Be'iro. My translation, he's ours. I know him, I love him, and so I don't see the drool, I see the person. Okay. To me, this is so deep. This is so deep, which is, what does it mean at the deepest level to love? What does it mean at the deepest level to love another person? What does it mean at the deepest level to love a shul, to love a country? What does it mean at the deepest level to love God? And I was thinking about it, which is, you love them, the whole package, including the imperfections, and you just love the whole package, which means that if you were, and I just kind of thought of this weird thought experiment. I thought, Shira and I are marking our 40-year anniversary next week. And I thought, if 18-year-old or 21-year-old Shira had written a checklist, a laundry list of all the qualities she wanted in a life partner, I would not have been what she would have picked. There's a lot that would have been on that list that I don't embody, and there's a lot of stuff I embody that would not have been on her list, right? But we're 40 years and going. And because real love is not a checklist, and real love is not external, and real love is not about perfect. Real love is about accepting a whole package. And when you really know somebody because they're ours, you don't see the drool. You don't see the watering eyes. And so to me, there's a deep teaching about the nature of love and the difference between an interview process where externals matter a lot and real life where the total package is what matters.
Yeah. But, and, like another rabbi famously said, yes, and. In order for the congregants, going back to the drooling, not to see your drooling, you have to create something with them. You have to build community. You have to be, in order to be liked, you need to provide skills. You need to be good at what you do, and to create deep and long-lasting relationship. It's not that magically comes, and because we love everybody as a whole package, we are going to love this. Imagine we have a president in the country who how it's called when you can not, like Moses, stutters, all right? If he's a good president and does a lot of things, he'll be loved. If not, we have to deal with this guy, and on top of that, he doesn't know how to
Well,
talk.
Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Greatest
Right.
Jew ever, stuttered.
Exactly.
Greatest
So it's
Jew
not
ever
it's
stuttered,
not that
greatest leader ever
magically
stuttered.
it's not that magically we love everybody for who they are.
But
Right.
I don't know that it's about love, right? I actually I love your love piece. It was really deeply moving and beautiful.
Mazel tov.
And yes, and Mazel Tov.
And?
And I don't know that it's actually about love. I think it's actually about the work that a community, what I love about this text
Right.
is not what it says about the Kohen and the work the Kohen has to do. It's what it says about the work the community has to do. And I think about this a lot. When we went to Nalagat, they spoke, which is for people who are blind, right? And they give you the experience of what it feels like to navigate the world in their experience. And they say, ask questions. Ask us so many questions. There's no question that is off base. There's no question that's not polite. We want you to get to know us so that we can become normal to each other. And I think, look, this is a big topic of conversation within the disability community. How much do you say, oh, it's not polite to say it's not polite to look, it's not polite to, and how much do you say, hey, I want to get to know you and your experience so that we can find commonality and see each other for the image of God. And I think what's so brilliant about this Talmudic text is that it's representing a community that actually has said, I know you well enough. I've invested in you. I've cared about you. I've asked about you. I've walked through life with you, so that you are like me and I am like you.
Great. So I want to. So there's another piece of the Talmud that we don't have time to talk about, but it's a second story where it reaffirms the prohibition that if you're a Kohen that's missing an eye, you're a one-eyed Kohen, you cannot officiate in the holy precincts. And they say, but wait a minute, Rabbi Yochanan offers the stricture, and then somebody says, hey, yeah, but Rabbi Yochanan, in your shul, there's a one-eyed Kohen, and he says, yeah, but he's ours, Dash Be'iro, and then you get another Braita. So you have a lot of structure. You have a lot of structure that's parallel. You have a stricture, the drooling Kohen can't officiate. Rav Huna affirms that, but then he's good with his own drooling Kohen, and there's because he's ours, and the Braita reaffirms that. And then you have the same stricture for a one-eyed Kohen. I think it's Rabbi Yochanan who reaffirms you can't have a one-eyed Kohen. Hey, but Rabbi Yochanan, you have a one-eyed Kohen. Well, he's ours, and then there's a Braita. So I think that's about. And by the way, I do think if you look at the way that the conservative movement has changed in the last 50 years, it's a lot about this, which is a bar mitzvah is really for boys. Running the service is really about men. And then Mordechai Kaplan said, yeah, but I got daughters. And what about my daughters, right? And all these people who are patriarchal and traditional, and it's men. When it's their granddaughter, right? It's my granddaughter, Dash Be'iro. She's ours. All of a sudden, they see it differently. The same thing with gay 30 years ago or 20 years ago, or the same thing with trans today. When they're ours, you just see it differently. Then there's one whole other, I think, story, which will, at the very end. So Dan, if you'll just read on page 5 of the handout. And this is, Rabbi Yehuda says, a Kohen whose hands are stained. This is on the second column on page 5.
Okay, a Kohen whose hands are stained may not raise his hands to bless the people.
Right, so that is going back to the initial first teaching, right? If you're a Kohen and your hands are stained, you can't bless the people. And the whole sugya ends by completely undermining it. Keep going.
Yeah, the Gemara teaches an exception to this ruling. It was taught in a Braita If an occupation of
If the occupation.
if the occupation of the majority of men in that city involved this, it is permitted for such a Kohen to bless the people, since the congregation will not stare at his hands.
So this is just so evocative, right? So if you're a tanner or a dyer and a Kohen and you live in a community of white collar people, you can't do it because they'll be like, oh my God, look at his hand. But if you're in a blue collar community of tanners and dyers, no issue. In other words, there is a relationship between the rule and the room. You have to read the room. And how will this stricture land in this room of people? In other words, all standards don't exist in the abstract. All standards have to live in a room of real people. And what are the implications of that?
So I love this because it goes back to Michelle's point that it's not about the Kohen. It's about the community, and it's about what prevents the community from being in the moment and being in the ritual practice.
Right.
And that would extend to a Kohen who has a really annoying habit of like tapping their foot or messing with papers, or like you could think of a zillion distracting practices that would have nothing to do with physical ability and would prevent a kahal from being able to really daven. That would be prohibited unless it's a whole community of paper wrestlers or foot tappers, or like that's just what people do.
You mean like people talking in Shacharit?
Yeah.
For example.
But guys, can we just, I want to just double click on this because this feels to me in such a short little sugya. This is Garrison Kaler. So deep, so deep. What are the implications of this? That is to say, there's a rule and there's a standard, but if you have a room full of people that this rule doesn't really apply to, or just really doesn't connect with, or it doesn't really see the people, you alter the rule. Rule and the room. What comes up for you when you think about the relationship between that?
That's the foundation of a really core Jewish idea, which is minhag hamakom, right? We actually say, Dan, go to you and say, Dan, what's the Torah trope? And you'll say, here's a big, huge book that I have filled, and let me tell you all about the Torah trope that comes from this part of the world and that part of the world and this part of the world. Like the idea that actually we need an adaptive community and we need standards that things that are obvious here. Even in this room right here, we're in the sanctuary, right? Things that are obvious in our sanctuary are not obvious in Reisman with Minyan Me'or, and the opposite.
Right. So that's certainly true liturgically with Trump, but I think it's true in much deeper ways. And I'll give you a more innocent issue and the hardest issue, which is, and we've all talked about this. It's Memorial Day weekend coming up. We have families who are longtime families, and they are doing their wedding on Shabbos. So if you look at, we have a longtime stricture. You don't do weddings on Shabbos. And all of us have really complied with that stricture. We urge people to do their wedding. If they really want a Saturday night affair, do it in October, November, December, January, February, March, before daylight savings time, when it's not daylight savings time. And then you could, Shabbos is over at 4 or 5, and then we can do your wedding at 6 or 7. And that happens in the fall months. But you can't do it in May because it's on Shabbos, or else do it on the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend. But our people are telling us thanks, but no thanks. We'll find a brother or a sister, we'll find a friend, we'll find a rabbi online who will officiate on a Saturday at 4 o'clock when Shabbos isn't over till 10 o'clock or 9:30. How does this rule about, when the congregation has a congregation of tanners can have a Kohen who's a tanner, how does that affect your thinking about a Saturday wedding, a Shabbos wedding, or not?
I'm not sure I see the parallel because one is a practice and a decision to not participate in practice, and one is a physical presentation that has implications for how people see you, and I think those are two different things.
Anyone else? I would just say this. I think the biggest issues of our movement, and the other one obviously is intermarriage, right? Whereas this is all about, you have a standard. Jews should marry Jews. Jews should marry Jews. It makes for a cleaner Jewish family. It makes easier raised Jewish kids, et cetera, et cetera. and that's been our movement stricture position since 1970. And to this day, a conservative rabbi who violates that stricture is booted from the movement to this day. And you have a world where something like 70% of non-Orthodox kids are marrying out of the faith, marrying somebody who's not born Jewish and not converting. And so I think you have, and how you handle that and how you process that, reasonable minds can disagree. Even in this group of the clergy team, reasonable minds can disagree. But I think this last little piece of the Garrison Kaler sugya is just so evocative. What happens when you have a standard and you have a rule and you have a people that can't live with it or that don't abide by it?
So I think that would be more similar if we're talking about a rabbi who is married to somebody who is not Jewish, not about officiating necessarily, but when is it distracting to have a rabbi who is married to somebody not Jewish? If the majority of the community is interfaith, then that's not a distracting.
Well, right, and indeed, Hebrew College now admits rabbinical students who are interfaith, who are married to a non-Jewish partner.
Totally, I think, but
that's this sugya in real life.
And the sugya in real life is saying that the rule that we're upholding is that anyone who's getting up in front of community to lead spiritual practice is conducting themselves in a way and appearing in a way that doesn't take away from the ritual that they're leading. And I'm not sure, like, that feels true across the board.
Yeah. I tend to agree with you. I don't see the connection between these two, the story originally and what you are bringing up. I think that in the first case, it's we as a congregation, we have to adapt to this priest who has some type of physical condition, and the other stuff that you are bringing is this leader has to adapt to the congregation. There are two different things.
Right, but in the second case,
it's like saying,
right.
like in modern age will be like saying, we don't like what this guy, the rabbi, says about not marrying us because we are not Jews, but we have to adapt to him. And you are bringing the opposite.
No,
Right?
but
the leader has to adapt to the congregation.
I think the Talmud, just to be clear, I think the Talmud is bringing us two different cases. One is a case of the officiant who has some physical deal. Either they drool, or their eyes water, or they're a one-eyed Kohen. And ordinarily, that's not the standard. We don't like drooling Kohanim, we don't like Kohanim with eyes watering, and we like our Kohanim to have two eyes. But in this case, because this Kohen is a member of our community, and we know them and we love them, we've had Shabbos dinner with them, we've known them for years, and to your earlier point, they add lots of other value. They're a mensch, and they're a great singer, and they're very learned, and they're available, and they play soccer with the kids, and they're just wonderful. We'll overlook the drool. That's one thing. But the second basis, and it's a different basis, is you can't have a rule that says no tanning hands for Kohen work when you have an entire community of tanned hands. You have to then modify the standard as it applies to this community. And I'm just saying that I think that invites a thoughtful conversation, a thoughtful lens. I think that, the conservative movement is thinking deeply, even now, about this issue of intermarriage. I think it's precisely this: how much do you reinforce the standard, and how much do you say this standard has got to be tweaked or adapted or evolve because we have a whole community that is not living with it?
I've got to agree with my colleagues here. I don't necessarily see this particular. You can bring another text that might have that conversation. I don't see this text moving in that direction. To the extent that I could do a bridge, I would invite the question about sort of the immutable versus the permanent, right? One of the things that's happening in this text is you have someone who has a permanent disability. They can't change that about themselves in any way, shape, or form. And therefore, it makes sense that the community who knows you, who loves you, if they work and they invest to regulate themselves, they can come to be able to enable all the people who could give their best spiritual gift to the community to be able to do that in that context. And I see that second case as being exactly the example. I see it as an example of that. You have a place where everybody's a tanner. So actually, not only is this imperfection not an imperfection because everybody else shares it, they're actually kind of at the highest level because they've all bought into this state. Whereas in the intermarriage, like, I just did the most glorious chuppah this past weekend for a couple who had been married for 4 years, and one of them converted, and then they did their chuppah together, and it was deeply meaningful, and it was profound, and it was them, changing their life journey together at a different time. Had they done the Jewish wedding back then, they would not have been able to have this beautiful moment.
So, colleagues, I want to just wrap up by saying I think that this issue doesn't only have liturgical or ritual significance. I think this whole question about the relationship between the rule and the room, the relationship between the standard, whatever the standard is, and the real people in this affected community who are going to have to live with it, has liturgical and has technical ritual applications. It also has the deepest policy implications as well. And I just want to end with a quote that I'll just read. Robert Putnam, the guy at Harvard who wrote Bowling Alone, also wrote American Grace, which is about religious life in America. He wrote this, it came out in 2010, and it's exactly about the rule and the room, how the room affects the rule. So he writes, the family tree of Robert Putnam, he's writing about himself, encapsulates religious churn that is so common in America. He's writing about himself in the third person, very Seinfeld, George. He writes, he and his sisters were raised as observant Methodists in the 1950s. He converted to Judaism at marriage. He and his wife raised their 2 children as Jews. One child married a practicing Catholic who has since left the church and is now secular. The other child married someone with no clear religious affiliation, but who subsequently converted to Judaism. Meanwhile, Putnam's sister married a Catholic and converted to Catholicism. Her 3 children became devout, active evangelicals of several different varieties. So this homogeneous Methodist household in mid-century America has given rise to an array of religious affiliations and non-affiliations that reflects the full gamut of American religious diversity. It would be hard to rouse anti-Jewish or anti-evangelical or anti-Catholic or anti-Methodist or even anti-secular fervor in this group. Our own families exemplify how religious pluralism is not merely an abstraction. Pluralism is often personal, and that personal pluralism means that America is graced with religious harmony. So I just want to end with a question for all of us to think about, which is, how do the realities of our lived lives and of the lived lives of the people that you know and love, how does it shape the standards that we claim adherence to? Shabbat Shalom.